Okay, folks, I want to present to you another dear friend in the industry, and Dan's done a fantastic job with the state of Ohio and our various cemetery associations we've had down through the years. He was very instrumental in merging the two groups together, which happened about 2 years ago, and Dan's tremendous support to us. He's put together a wonderful panel, and I'm going to turn this over to Dan and let him do his thing. Congratulations, my friend. Thank you. Use an extra mic. You want to just turn this one off?
Yeah, I might do. They can all stay on. Okay, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Thank you, John.
I was going to say, good morning, Mr. Applegate.
I want to get started with this panel discussion. Those of you who attended the winter conference, we had a great panel discussion at that conference, and it went so well we decided we would try it again at this conference. I think based on yesterday's panel, a lot of good give and take from that discussion, and as a matter of fact, gave us some ammunition to work with here today too. So what I want to do first is give a brief introduction of the panelists. We're fortunate that we have a very, what I would call, eclectic group of panelists here. And on my extreme left, we have Dave Dahl. And as I said, brief introduction. Dave Dahl is president of Milne Construction Company and all subsidiaries. Since 1953, the Milne Company has specialized in the design and construction of quality, poured-in-place concrete mausoleums and columbariums throughout the United States, Canada, and Australia. And Dave is experienced in all of those locations and countries. To my left, we have Josh Slocum. Josh Slocum joined the Funeral Consumers Alliance staff in 2002 and became executive director in 2003. He has appeared as an expert commentator on funeral issues in national media such as 60 Minutes, the New York Times, CNN, ARP Magazine, and CBS News. Josh has written numerous articles in mainstream and funeral trade publications, including a feature article on the funeral fraud for Consumers Digest magazine. In 2009, he testified before a congressional committee on the need to bring cemeteries, crematories, and all death industry vendors under the Federal Trade Commission's funeral rule, the only national protection funeral consumers enjoy. Slocum offered commentary to congressional staff that helped shape the Bereaved Consumers Protection Act of 2009, a bill to expand funeral consumer safeguards. In 2011, he published Final Rites, Reclaiming the American Way of Death, with co-author Lisa Carlson. And to my right, you met yesterday Gail Rubin. The Guardian of Death is a certified celebrant, a life tribute professional, personally trained by Doug Manning and Glenda Stansberry of the Insight Institute, the leading U.S. organization that trains celebrants. Gail is also a public relations professional, event planner, and speaker. She has more than 30 years of experience creating many memorable life cycle events. Her award-winning book, A Good Goodbye, Funeral Planning to Those Who Don't Plan to Die, provides everything you never knew you needed to know about funeral planning and brings light to a dark subject. And then to my extreme right is a face and a person we all know, Tim Long. Tim Long has practiced law in Columbus, Ohio since 1988 and has featured Ohio cemetery law as a principal area of emphasis to the general practice, which includes most notably real estate, estate planning, and general business since the early 1990s. He has nearly 2 decades of experience advising cemeteries and their principals and cemetery associations. He was a legal counsel for the OACS&O and currently serves as counsel for the Ohio Cemetery Association. So ladies and gentlemen, there are our panelists. Please give them a hand. Also, We have, or you should have, pieces of paper on your table. What we would like for you to do as we work through the panel discussion this morning is if we stimulate a question, or if you think of one on your own, please feel free to write that question down, and John Onstead will be going circulating the room and picking up those questions and passing them off to us so we can address those questions. So please feel free to do that. So to get started, right out of the box, I'm going to start with Dave Dahl. Dave, as we mentioned, has a lot of experience within North America, including Canada and Australia, building mausoleums. And I thought we may just kick things off by asking Dave today, Dave, what do you see in the future in terms of trends for not only mausoleum, but just trends in general in your travels?
Thanks, Dan. Obviously, cremation, and it's been a big topic in every conference I've been to. And I know that your cremation rate might not be as high as some of the others. You know, I live in Portland, Oregon. Our cremation rate is extremely high. Australia has always had a very high cremation rate. So when people ask me, what do I recommend? I tell them to go to the ACCA website, and that's the Australasian Cemeteries and Crematoria Association. The website is accaweb.com.au. They've been doing it for a long time, and they make money at it. If they show value, it's a value service for them. I think in the Northwest it snuck up on the cemeteries and they didn't want to show value and just pushed it aside, and they're feeling the pain now. The Northwest surpassed Hawaii in the cremation. So I would recommend looking at what Australia does, because I think they do a good job at it. The other things I've seen in my travels, in Sydney there's a couple memorials that have been placed, one for missing persons. It's called Doorway to Hope. And it's a section in the cemetery that is a place for people to go and reflect and still have hope. They can buy memorial plaques and place those on the curb. It's been a successful product for Warren Norris Cemetery. They've also put in Falling Angels. This is for babies before 20 weeks gestation without a death certificate, so another area for families to go and grieve. I presented that Falling Angels concept in a conference in Washington. The Tears Foundation in Seattle picked up on it. We're partnering with Washington Memorial in SeaTac, who's donated the land. Firing Monuments was donating the granite, and then Life's Memories were donating the glass plaque for this memorial. So we brought that now to America. But I would say cremation is probably the biggest challenge and change that I see now and moving forward.
And Dave, just to tease that out a little bit, in terms of cremation and the growth of cremation, how does that affect your business specifically in cemeteries in the construction of mausoleum?
I think you see it in the vendors. There's a lot more niche columbaria, exclusively niche columbaria companies that come out and try to support that need. For us as a design builder, we're concerned about this columbarium lasting for perpetuity, so it needs to be properly designed. You have a frost depth here that's significant, so you need a foundation that won't heave in the frost condition with freezing thaw. So I would say that the foundation depth is important. Make sure that it's properly designed. The size of the niche is changing. It used to be 8 by 8, 10 by 10, now they're 12 by 12. The urns are getting taller, so it's important to understand the size and the need that the families wish to have, and maybe you can cater the urn size for that. The shape and color is important, feng shui, and the feel of the unit. Sealers on niches, often you'll find shutters would cover 4 niches in the shutter, just for less hardware, less cost. So having a sealer behind that shutter is important, not to expose the urn. And security as well, whether it's a concealed hardware system. ICOF has made a concealed hardware for years. It used to be a glued on epoxy. Now they make a mechanical fastener. I think it's called the T31 hanger. So concealed hardware or vandal stop screw. Milne makes a screw, we drill a hole in a nylon plug. So there's different ways to help security. Those are some of the 4 elements I see in the cremation and the niche construction.
Gail, turning to you.
Yes, sir.
As a funeral celebrant, what do you feel is happening in terms of funerals, funeral rites, and memorializations in terms of cremation?
One of the things that I have done over the past 2 years and I'm getting ready to do, in fact, as soon as I get back to Albuquerque, is a project I call my 30 Funerals in 30 Days. I actually read the obituaries and go and attend the funerals or memorial services of people I don't know. And I have noticed over the past 2 years, and I think I'm going to see it again, is a lot of cremation. But still, there is memorialization. In fact, the last one that I attended last year was for a woman who was my own age, which made me decide to focus on people closest to my own age for this year's project. She was cremated. Her ashes were in an urn of Himalayan rock salt. The funeral home chapel was packed with people celebrating this woman's life. The music was rock and roll. There were all these items that illustrated her life. And just before I came out here for this conference, a fire chief was killed in a rollover accident. And there was a huge memorialization for him. And yet at the very center of it, in this big full-color picture in the Albuquerque Journal, you're seeing 4 people carrying an urn. So he had chosen cremation, and yet there was still all of the bells and whistles in terms of a big memorial show in honor of this fire chief. So even though we do have cremation rates rising, and I know Josh is going to have an issue with this probably, but people are still spending money on memorialization, which is a good thing in terms of people stopping and noticing and respecting the fact that, yes, somebody we love has died. And that is the big role that memorialization plays. You don't have to spend a lot of money in memorialization, but the fact that people stop and have a ceremony and actually recognize it is good for the family. It's good for everybody's emotional health. In the Association for Death Education and Counseling, I hear plenty of stories of people who are just like, just cremate them, get them done, don't want to think about it. 6 months later, they're having emotional issues, processing and grieving and moving on.
Good. And so Gail mentions that Josh may have a problem with that, so let's hear if Josh, in fact, does have a problem with it.
Gail, you know me better than that. Gail was actually at the Funeral Consumers Alliance National Conference, and Gail, just a couple of months ago, and Gailey stepped up to do a couple of presentations for us when one of our speakers backed out at the last minute. So she's pretty awesome all the way around, especially with the skulls and roses. No, Josh doesn't have an issue with memorialization, neither does Funeral Consumers Alliance. What we're concerned about is making sure that people have informed, can make an informed decision whether they choose burial, cremation, direct cremation, or viewing beforehand. It makes absolutely no difference to me if they want to spend $20,000 on the party of their lives, or, well, the party they would have had in their life. As long as they do so because it's meaningful to them and they weren't deceived into doing it. And I have been at Funeral Consumers Alliance for 10 years, and we probably get, phone traffic has slowed somewhat as more people are actually going to the internet rather than seeing an 800 number dialing and saying, can you mail me some literature? So our web traffic has sort of gone up commensurately with phone calls dropping, but we still get several thousand calls a year in my office, which is just 2.5 staff. And I probably respond to 5,000 or 6,000 emails a year. And what consumers have been telling us that they want are options aside from what I call my grandma's funeral. The Batesville casket, the 2 days of lying in state, the receiving line, et cetera, where they want burial or cremation, they're less and less interested in that, and they'd like to know what options are, even if they choose cremation. Some people are simply going to want a direct cremation. Other people are going to want something more, and you may be surprised to hear me say that when we encourage funeral planning, that's what we're there for, we're a nonprofit educational organization, but when people say, I want to make sure that my body goes to science and I don't want anybody crying, I just want a simple cremation with this, that. I mean, I will tell consumers right away, you can do what you want. Personally, I think it's extraordinarily selfish to tell your children either what they must do when you die or what they must not do. So I actually had to talk to people and say, you know what, if you need to have a memorial service, even if Uncle Johnny said he didn't want anybody raising a glass, well, guess what? Uncle Johnny's not here, but you are. So, I don't have a problem with that, but I can tell you that as more people turn to cremation, you know that some of them are not going to use your cemeteries and some of them are, and I won't go into a lot. I'll do more when I talk about my talk later, but there are some concerns and some confusion that consumers have about the burial of cremated remains.
Tim, I want to bring you into this now. We talked yesterday, this is where some of the discussion from yesterday comes into play. We talked yesterday about some of the township concerns of assuming the responsibility and, in fact, the liabilities that would go along with, for instance, churches beginning cemeteries, scattering gardens with their niche banks inside the church. And my question to you is, and maybe you don't have an immediate answer to this, but my question is, is there something that we should be thinking of as an association to talk to the General Assembly about limiting that practice? Because there is always a possibility that those responsibilities are going to fall back on townships.
Yeah, Dan, it's a tricky situation there with the freedom of religion and the legislature not wanting to tell a church that maybe isn't as well-heeled, financially powerful as the big one down the street, that they don't have all the rights and privileges if they were a little bit wealthier. But as it stands today, there's no inquiry into the financial status of a church that wants to go to columbarium. So a local issue first, whether cemeteries are allowed in the municipality, at least in Ohio it is, it's a local issue. And if they are, a church can build a columbarium as long as they can afford it, get a building permit, and there's no inquiry into the financial well-being of the church. So I would think maybe something along those lines, not a prohibition, not an exclusion of columbariums from churches. And I've seen around here, at least locally, most of them are outside of the building. I don't know, maybe that's a new trend that I'm not seeing anything built in the church building. They're usually out in a prayer garden, and I've never seen one become in disrepair and abandoned. So I don't think that is an imminent issue for townships. I think they have much larger problems than that. I mean, that was thrown out as a possibility, but at least the projects that I've seen are the larger churches with large memberships. One individual that I've talked to over the last few years in that regard, I mean, they sold out of their first niche bank before it's constructed. There's a demand within a church, and there's that kind of money. I don't think that that should be on the top 10 watch list for the townships.
Comment on that, are they churches required to put in a percentage of endowment perpetual care fund?
No, they're not.
That's where I think the should be pushed.
that would be another logical step to safeguard against the abandonment issue.
Well, I'm going to contradict myself here, and I know that Dane has instructed cribs, am I right, cribs in Columbarium at Notre Dame? I'm wondering if I can get the rights to Ohio State. That's what I'd like to do. I'd like to build some niches into the Ohio University, the stadium.
It's actually at Cedar Grove Cemetery on campus, so it is in a cemetery.
Okay.
I think they bought a few holes on the golf course.
To change topics just slightly, cremation is obviously something we're all thinking about a lot. We're always thinking about the threat that it provides to us. It also provides some challenges, but some opportunities. But one of the things that I'd like to talk about here now is turn our attention to some of the other less obvious challenges or threats that we're facing from your own perspective. And I guess start with Tim.
Less obvious challenges. I think that as an industry, there's a lot of dialogue about cremation. I think that we need to get out in front of the alkaline hydrolysis issue. Whether that provision is added back into the House bill that's been passed through the House this fall on the Senate side or not, I think it's just a matter of time until in Ohio that's an approved method of final disposition. So that would be a challenge for cemeteries in Ohio, much like Dave's comment on the maybe not getting out in front of the cremation opportunity in the Northwest. I look at it as both a challenge and an opportunity. People want to still memorialize at your cemetery, regardless of the means of final disposition. It's the same opportunity.
Can I say something on that?
Sure.
The alkaline hydrolysis, to me, looks as though it could be a replay of what happened with cremation maybe 40, 45 years ago. I have no idea whether it's going to really take off as a form of disposition that people really like, but it is going to be legalized. And I would just say, don't make the mistake that the funeral directors made when cremation came along and dig in your heels and fight it and go to the legislature and say this shouldn't be allowed or poo-poo the option or not be available for families and say, okay, if you choose this, we can still offer you this kind of interment or this kind of memorialization, because the funeral directors themselves really shot themselves in the foot, both PR-wise and financially, 30 years ago when they refused to embrace cremation, and they had to catch up after that. And you can do better than that. You can get ahead of that.
In fact, after field day yesterday, I had the opportunity to visit with Jeff Edwards, the funeral director here in Columbus, who is the man behind the case in terms of bringing alkaline hydrolysis here to the state. So currently, that's on hold because the state Senate needs to reconcile the bill that's currently going through the legislature here. It's in Maine, it's in Florida, it's in Minneapolis, and it is growing. This is a lower energy use disposition method, and he says families want it. He's got people who are doing pre-need with him, even though he still can't give it to them right now. So there is a lot of interest in the public with this disposition method.
Dave, you have anything in terms of less obvious threats or challenges?
I think bringing food into the service is important. We're doing a lot more combo facilities where you'll have a chapel reception, but you can keep the families there at the cemetery. I think that's important. Also, the green burial is something to look at. In Australia, they have limited tenure. In a few of the states where they don't have the deed to the land, they just lease it, maybe 50 years. I think deferred cremation might be written into the deed as an option. I'm not certain legally if that would work, but perhaps in the deed you say you own that crypt for 30, 50 years, and in the deed you disinter and cremate and reuse the crypt.
Europe does this. That's not common.
So I think the combo facility is something that needs to be looked at.
Got a couple questions from the floor that are very similar, so I'll bring those in. One deals with what would you recommend, and this really is something that all of us can address. What would we recommend in terms of instilling the importance of memorialization for purchasers and those who have had a deceased? Gail?
How to instill that importance? There are going to be those families that are just, we just want to get this done and put it behind us. And I would suggest maybe bringing up this idea of life cycle events, really matchings, hatchings, and dispatchings. We have communities that come together and celebrate each of the coming together of a couple, the birth of a new baby, and yes, the community is involved with saying goodbye to somebody we love. Very often, if you've got a family that's saying we don't want to do anything, maybe they're not quite in touch with that community that wants to help them, and to maybe suggest to them that that loved one that has died has a broader impact than perhaps they know, and that to welcome the support of their community is what a funeral or memorial service is all about. And it can be both laughter and tears involved with it, because some families are saying, oh, don't cry, just have a party. But that may not be as emotionally fulfilling for the family as something that has both laughter and tears. So it's a matter of helping people realize that it's a party, but funerals are the parties no one wants to plan. And planning ahead and having a conversation can be very helpful in terms of fulfilling that.
I'm reading a book right now called Sorrow and Solace by Philip Batchelor. It's a good book on that subject.
I'd like to suggest, and again, I'm not trying to be a naysayer, I'm actually trying to be your friend a little bit here. I'm not going to tell you how to sell more to people, but I can suggest ways that they will want to buy what you have if you change what you buy. You can't instill the value of memorialization in anybody. We don't have slots for USB ports to go in there. And this is another mistake that the funeral directing industry has made. They have been using a phrase called the value of viewing, teaching the value of viewing. They have been using this for 45, 50 years in their trade magazines, and they are still writing this nonsense. And lo and behold, people are having fewer and fewer open casket viewings and more cremation. You can't make people be where you are, but you might be able to get ahead of where they want to be. And I don't want to sort of shoot my whole talk out already, but I think there are ways, non-traditional ways, that you can both offer services that people are going to pay for, but also get yourself some PR for them in the community that don't look like, well, frankly, the morose advertisements that you see for most funeral things, where there's soft focus music and a very attractive 80-year-old lady looking like this, and somebody intoning about how they have provided dignified service for 70 years. This is not appealing to people, but I have some ideas about things that might be, so.
Okay. Doubling back, because we probably should have talked about this to begin with, and any four of you can address this, but the question is, what exactly is alkaline hydrolysis, and why does it pose a threat to cemeteries? Who wants to field that?
I can tell you. Okay, alkaline hydrolysis is a process whereby the body the decomposition process is speeded up by putting the body into a tank, which is filled with water and chemicals like lye, and brought up to temperature and pressure. And within 8 hours, the body is reduced to a coffee-colored sterile liquid that is pH neutral, safe for putting down the drain. And what you have left is primarily very fine bone ash powder that is it's about equivalent to the amount of bone fragment ash you have left after a fire-based cremation. However, alkaline hydrolysis uses about 1/10 of the energy that flame-based cremation uses. So in that regard, it's more environmentally friendly, and the units cost less than a retort. And so it has a number of advantages in that regard. You still wind up with some ashes to memorialize, but people may do other things with them other than put them in the ground or put them in a niche.
Chemicals that are used for that are, I mean, I know the body isn't, it's pH and it's friendly and everything, but the chemicals that are used, how friendly are they?
They're natural, basic chemistry chemicals.
I believe, and someone can check me, I'm sure some of you have smartphones, I believe it's potassium hydroxide. I might be getting the second part of that wrong. But if I understand correctly,
Potassium, yeah, definitely.
if I understand correctly, they do have to add an acid back to the end of the process to bring it to a neutral pH so that it's acceptable for the sewer treatment system. But that apparently is very easy to accomplish.
So we're drinking people
Just
Drinking people, well, just the same as you're drinking blood, formaldehyde, and embalming fluid that's already going in there. I mean, we have water treatment systems, and we don't like to think about what all of us do in the bathroom every day, but you're drinking that too. Sorry, it's reality.
And actually, when I talked to Jeff Edwards yesterday, he said in Maine and in other cities where it's been added to the system, it actually boosts the efficiency of the water treatment system.
see, it's a gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but just when you think cremation comes along and it can't get worse. All right. Let's see here. Anybody else have any other questions? Got one here. The American culture is changing. How does that manifest itself, or does it, with our industry? Anybody?
The baby boomer silver tsunami. They want what they want when they want it, and it's changing. It's definitely different. I just went to a home funeral and burial. I actually coached the son. His father had died at home on his 40 acres of property out east of Albuquerque, and he washed and dressed his father's body, dug the grave on the homestead, and did the burial himself. Now, I don't think we're going to see that many people wanting to bury on their own property, but I hear a lot of inquiries about it. So that's something that you need to be aware of. Plus, maybe you can talk about this, but people getting cremated and just burying their own ashes on their own property. Is there any rule against that?
That would be an issue of local zoning ordinance, township zoning restrictions. If you're in most cities would have a rule against that. Most subdivisions would have a deed restriction against burial. I don't know how well refined the deed restriction would be to define whether burying ashes would be considered a burial, but that's a local issue. If you Ohio Revised Code, there would not be an impediment to that.
When it comes to that, well, first of all, I'm not aware of very many, if any, I can think of off the top of my head, zoning restrictions that specifically address ashes. I mean, I live in a small city called Winooski, and I can't just bury, if my grandma dies, I can't bury her on my 1/16 of an acre next to my neighbor's house. But when my cat dies, I fully intend to bury her under the tomato plants. And if I had cremated remains, I'm not going to ask the city fathers if I can bury them either. No one else is. So I don't think that's anything we can get ahead of. When it comes to culture changing, and I'm sure you all know this as well, people are moving around. I mean, we are way, way more mobile during the course of our lives than our parents or grandparents were. And people have less of an attachment to the family plot back in the old homestead that nobody's lived in for 25 years. So I think of ways that people who may not have grown up where your cemetery is, but may have made their retirement there, that may be more appealing to them than hoping to count on revenue for people who are going to use graves that maybe Jim and Jane bought in the 60s for all 4 kids because we'd all need them. A lot of people aren't using those.
Yeah, but there's your argument for burying it behind in somebody's backyard. You're not going to live there forever. Your family's not going to be there forever, but yet you're going to have your loved one or whatever buried there.
What, the ashes?
Could be.
Yeah, people who do whole body burial at home, and I discussed this with them.
People who do whole body burial at home and act as their own funeral director. I tell them, I know, listen, you've got 40 acres here. I know that you farmed it, and I know that it's been your family for this many generations. But you all need to sit and think really long and hard about whether you're certain that it's going to be in your family for other generations. Some people this matters to, and honestly, some people it does not. A friend of mine had buried the ashes of her husband who committed suicide in the farm that he used to live in Vermont, put up a stone, natural stone for him, and inscribed it herself. They no longer live there, and she's fine with that. But yeah, it's something that people have to think about.
Then does it get disclosed to the new people that bought it? But they're not.
That there are ashes there? Come on.
What do you mean, come on?
This has never come up.
For me, a whole body burial, yes. But if somebody is putting an urn down under the earth, I mean, all of us who bought and sold property have bought houses where somebody likely buried Muffy or the dog in the backyard. I mean, a whole body, absolutely, I think you'd have to disclose it, but it's unlikely to be there in the first place. At any rate, that's the homeowner's decision, not mine.
You mentioned nomadic, and I think if you look at Mongolia, they were nomadic. They now have memorial cemeteries, and in Australia they have a group that comes to the conference and talk about how they've changed from their abandonment, which is how they used to bury, just let the buzzards take care of them, to having memorial parks. And one way they've done that with the nomadic people is to have websites. And obviously with the internet, a lot of you have websites. If you don't, you should get one. And have, there's one out there called Web Address, and there's lots of other virtual memorializations. And I think with our people moving around the United States and the homeland, and maybe not where they're buried, you can still have some of that service available for the families through your website.
Okay, switching a little bit. I want to talk about Green Barrett for a minute, for a couple minutes. I think there is an analogy between green burial today and cremation from 40 or 50 years ago. And I think 40 or 50 years ago, people would have looked at, and Josh alluded to it, the funeral directors dug in their heels and did not adjust well. I think there was probably at that time some discussion as to whether it was a fad or whether it was something that was actually going to go mainstream. Well, percentages tell us it's mainstream now. It's extremely mainstream. So my question is, green burial, is it what I alluded to as a fad at this point? Has it gone beyond something that is a fad, that is just experimental to see if it's going to work? And what are your predictions or projections on whether it's going to become mainstream or not? Dave, I'll start with you.
I see them popping up everywhere. Even cemeteries have sections now for green burial. I think it will be here. Tyler Cassidy in California bought a cemetery in San Francisco specifically for this. There was a talk in Australia last year that actually looked at this very subject, and they're thinking it's not going to have a placeholder in Australia. There is a white paper out there on the acaweb.com about that subject. I'd encourage you to look at that. To me, I think it provides a valuable service to people that want that disposition. We heard Gail talk about the Jewish community that's a green burial as well in some of their burial rituals. So it's, I don't think, new to a lot of people. It's just something different. And the baby boomers like to have something different. So if you can provide that service and it's legal in your community, then I'm not opposed to it.
Yeah.
Well, it's certainly legal. I mean, the burial vaults are a requirement under the rules and regulations in the individual cemeteries, but not in the state statute. And in the state statute, there's not even a requirement for a casket. And I suppose, again, there should be a local inquiry as to whether there's any local rule, but I don't see a legal impediment to the whole concept of green burial at all. And again, whatever is a threat or a scary change is an opportunity for your cemeteries to get out in front of it, incorporate what you can provide to your customers with the means of final disposition that they want.
Yes, as I mentioned yesterday, there are different shades of green burial. You could still have what you offer as a conventional cemetery and let people know they don't have to be involved, the softwood casket in contact with the earth. If your particular rules still require some kind of vault-like structure to support the earth, there's the polyliner dome that goes over the casket. And yet, I would still encourage you to think about if you've got a section that you can set aside to be greener than that, to allow shroud burial, caskets directly in contact with the earth with no supporting over it. You just mount up that earth higher during the burial and let it settle over time. But if you let people know, yes, this is our dedicated green section of our cemetery, that can be an extra selling point for you, really. Because baby boomers don't see themselves being involved in a metal casket put on display in front of all their friends.
Let me just follow up on that with a commentary. When we're pre-planning with people, and they indicate that they're at least considering cremation, we tell all of our advisors that is a key word for they're looking for something different. It doesn't necessarily mean they're looking for cremation. They're looking for an alternative. And as we've talked our way through it at Arlington, we see the opportunity for green burial to actually keep the body in the cemetery as opposed to being cremated where it's taken off somewhere and scattered. So I think you have to keep your ear to the ground and eyes open when it comes to these types of things and think it through slowly. I'm not I'm not sure we'll do anything with green burial, but we certainly haven't closed our minds to that.
Just to give you a little bit of perspective, when I first joined Funeral Consumers in the early 2000s, there were, that I knew of, and 2 specifically dedicated cemeteries that were green. There was Billy Campbell's Ramsey Creek Preserve in South Carolina, and I think 1 in Florida. There are more than 60 today in the United States. Is it a barn burner? Is it taking over the country? No. However, a lot of people who choose cremation will say, well, you know, I want to be environmentally friendly. It's such a waste of land. We're running out of space for cemeteries. I have to disabuse people of this idea all the time. Outside of places like New York City, where, you know, we've got enough land for as many burials as we want indefinitely. If people say they want cremation because they believe that it's an environmentally friendlier choice, having a green burial option that you can present to them may well result in them having a whole body burial. And I would suggest also start talking to your colleagues at Western European cemeteries where it is considered ordinary that one leases the grave for 25 to 30 years. One does not expect that having walked the earth for 75 years, that you get this perpetual piece of land for the next 3,000 or however many. Europeans don't find it controversial to say, okay, then the bones can be put in the ossuary, and you know, I'm not saying that you can get out and force people to do that, but think about these things and maybe be ready for them if people ask you for them.
We design ossuary compartments in states that have limited tenure in Australia, and I agree with it. That's why I was pushing the deferred cremation option as a suggested writing in the deeds. So to me, it's an option. I think, again, that book, Sorrow and Solace, talks about that. It studies the visitation of graves in different deaths, whether it's a baby death or a tragic death or elderly death. So it's an interesting study. There's never been a study on that, and this is the first book on that. So it's an interesting reference book. Yes?
Can you just expand a little bit about the ossuary?
Ossuary is commingling of remains. Catacombs in France, that would be an ossuary. So it's either ashes or it can be bones. The ossuaries we designed are based on the longest bone, your femur leg. And we've converted couch crypts into 6 ossuary compartments. It was an area where those couches weren't selling, so we converted those to ossuaries so that they can reuse the crypt. So in the state of Western Australia, that specific cemetery, Karrakatta, is a 50-year tenure. And so they put notes on those graves, Memorial Day, special times. Is any family still visiting this grave? If you are, come to the office because we have plans to build or remove those graves. Our mausoleums there are actually built over the top of graves. We design the piles to be drilled between the graves and build basically on those pylons. And we do then cenotaphs on the building to name the people that are under the mausoleum. So there are many ways to deal with limited tenure. That's an example.
They do that in New Orleans too, don't they?
I'm not sure of the New Orleans laws.
I don't know, but I wanted to ask you a question about the ossuary. Would the bones that get moved there then be like a memorial plaque that lists all the names of the people who have been moved there?
Yeah, they sell it as a niche, that ossuary compartment. So the crypt is a commingling of maybe 6 niches. So the bones are assembled into one large compartment. So it's maybe the family ossuary buys those 6 compartments. You may see other ossuaries that are just for cremated remains and cenotaphs somewhere. I've seen that through the United States on the cremation side.
We've got about 15 minutes left, so anybody that has questions, please write them down and pass them up to us. One of the questions that I did receive from the floor, I kind of folds in with something that I had written down. And this is directed to Tim. What are some of the issues that could arise if the OCA would want to go through the process of issuing or requesting continuing education units to our membership?
Tying into yesterday's panel suggestion, for those of you that weren't here, the suggestion was made that there would be a continuing education requirement for cemetery trustees. I took it not to extend to the operators, but more to the trustees. But it's the same issue. Anytime that you add any such requirement for any professional designation of people, and cemetery trustees are not designated as a profession under the revised code currently, but there would have to be a whole statutory rubric of how you get the courses approved for credit. And there would need to be a body that would look at the material and decide whether it's a valid course for credit, and count towards however many hours are required. I mean, lawyers, for those of you that may not have been exposed to this, we need 24 hours every 2 years, report every 2 years, and it's quite often that you sign up for a seminar that the Supreme Court of Ohio decides whether that seminar is approved for what are called CLE credits, continuing legal education. Quite often you sign up for the seminar and it hasn't been approved yet, but because of the source of the seminar, their seminars are always approved, they have quality speakers, there's not going to be a problem. And so you sign up and pay the money. It's not always approved at the time that you do so, but there's a whole system in place to do that. So, I mean, it would be a new industry developing to create cemetery continuing education courses in Ohio that would have to be approved by some body of the government, probably the Department of Commerce right now. And, we need to revise the statute to create all that. Somebody would propose a bill in the legislature to revise code.
Josh, what do you think of as a consumer advocate? What do you think CEUs?
I think they can be done well or they can be done very poorly. Some states have really good statutes that say what you can award a CEU for and what you can't. Virginia comes to mind. They have an explicit provision in the state statutes for funeral directors. I don't know about cemetery folks. That the state will not award CEUs for any presentations that are primarily sales-based or that are put on by vendors who want to market their products primarily. It has to have a demonstrated educational purpose aside from retail training. And I think that's relevant. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with vendors and suppliers, but if the state is going to offer a professional designation, it should be for things like, I think Virginia suggests changes to the revised code, any applicable federal rules that happen. So whether they're necessary, that's more for you guys to say. But if they're done, I hope they're done well and not as a means of, showing up at nice conventions.
Dave, what have you seen?
I have to take continued education in all the states that I build. I think education is important. The more regulation that we are going to see, it's important that you're informed. I think there are other dispositions out there. Promessa, has anybody heard of Promessa? Susan from Sweden invented that. It's basically freeze drying. She talked in 2000 in Australia with Sandy Sullivan when he brought out recimation. That's what alkaline hydrolysis started, as recimation was a term on that. So that I think education is important. We get complacent, all of us, in our comfortable lives. I've seen Australia go through an amalgamation, and they've captured all the cemetery trust into, most of their cemeteries are owned by the government, so they've been regulated. but they've been given a lot of autonomy. That autonomy was abused. The government saw that. They also saw the profits that they were gaining. So they amalgamated a lot of the trust in the Northern and Southern Trust of Melbourne. It's happening right now in New South Wales. Warren Norris Cemetery just last week was amalgamated with Eastern Suburbs into the Southern Trust.
What does it mean,
It's just putting all trust into one. They sack the trust and then they appoint certain members to come in and try to take control. So I think education, just staying ahead of what's out there, understanding it so that you can better fight it if we need to fight it, and just be more informed.
Okay, in the interest of staying on schedule, I think that I will close this panel discussion. I'm sure there's some other things that we could discuss, and perhaps at another conference we will do that. I'd like to thank our panelists today, Tim Long, Gail Rubin, Josh Slocum, and Dahl. Let's give them a hand.